Hey y'all, I'm G, and welcome to the Bad Student Podcast. Today I will be discussing PEN America's newest report on the state of banned books in the United States of America. PEN America, or the Association of Poets, Essayists, and Novelists in America, is a US-based advocacy group for writers in hopes that they help keep their works from being censored or have the authors themselves be ostracized for their work. And obviously, a huge part of this is in relation to having authors' books be banned, restricted, or censored in ways that make them less accessible to all those around them and will also oftentimes muddle the original message that an author is trying to convey. So, PEN America defines a school book ban as any action taken against a book based on its content and as a result of parent or community challenges, administrative decisions, or in response to direct or threatened action by governmental officials that leads to a book being either completely removed from availability to students or where access to the book is restricted or diminished. This definition, some people find it a bit controversial because they think, well, in the United States, you can still have full access to this book if you just buy it. So that doesn't technically mean make it banned. However, I disagree with this because removing books from school libraries or public libraries is still an act of banning them because you're taking away the accessibility from those who do not have the money or the resources to just go out and purchase a book whenever they feel like it. Not everybody can just go to Barnes and Noble or go up on Amazon and buy a book, especially since books are getting increasingly more expensive. Reading should not be an activity that is, or more so, reading books, certain books, more controversial books, or books that make people think more, is not something that should be only accessible to those of higher income. Low income people deserve the right to have access to this information, regardless of income status. And now this report that PEN America published came out on October 1st of 2025, and I will be sure to link it down in the description. So for key trends from the 2024-2025 school year, which is the fourth year that they have been recording these bans, a big thing of note is how the federal government has been acting more as a way to put pressure on schools to ban or remove books, which has obviously been caused by Donald Trump returning as president of the United States, where he has been talking a big game about parents' rights, which has not only led to the banning of books, but also a much broader attack on education as a whole. He claims that he and his administration, the president this is, claims that they are returning education to the parents, which has basically been a greater way for them to crack down on public schools and keeping them from disseminating information to students that they personally do not like hearing, regardless of whether or not the information is factual or useful. And so some of the executive orders that have aided in this were called Ending Radical Indoctrination in K-12 Schooling, Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism, and Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferences, which is basically used to tell kids who are little girls or are members of some other racial or sexual minority or who have certain disabilities, pretty much any kid that can be part of a marginalized group, basically trying to dictate who or what they can be and trying to keep them from learning more about themselves. And these executive orders were used as a justification for the July 2025 removal of almost 600 books from the Department of Defense Education Activity, or DODEA, schools on military bases, which has then come around to spread to public schools across the nation. One significant part of these attacks is how the administration is conflating LGBTQ plus identities as inherently sexually explicit as opposed to treating them as the same way we often treat cisgender heterosexual couples as just being a fact of life. This is incredibly disturbing, especially because I speak from experience as somebody who is LGBTQ plus and was figuring all of this out as a kid. When you're raised in an environment where you don't know a lot of these things or where you're not exposed to a lot of these things as a kid, when you those feelings start emerging, which for me was around the time I was going through puberty, I was convinced that there was something wrong with me. Like I was the problem because I was looking at some of the other girls in my classes and I was getting the feeling that I might have had crushes on them. And I seriously felt that I was the problem, that I was some weird anomaly and that I had to suppress all of these parts of myself just because I didn't know that there were other people who felt that way. So I just assumed this wasn't the way I was supposed to feel. And so having age appropriate materials discussing sexuality or even just letting kids know that, hey, same sex couples exist and it's perfectly normal. There are plenty of same sex couples out there, just as there are plenty of opposite sex couples out there, and they're just couples like anybody else, is a very good thing. This normalization of this kind of thing is in my eyes, the easiest way to keep the discrimination from perpetuating, because discrimination is largely based on, well, that's not something I've seen before, and I don't find that normal, so therefore I think it's wrong. So if we just normalize all these behaviors, there's not going to be a whole basis of people seeing it as wrong just because they've never seen it before. Also, painting the entire LGBTQ plus community as inherently sexual always never made sense to me, especially when you consider asexual people, particularly sex repulsed asexual people, whose whole identity is about not feeling sexual attraction, and if you're sex repulsed, being, as the name implies, actively repulsed by the idea of sex and sexual activities. I find it weird that these people who perpetuate these beliefs are basically doing the opposite of what asexual identities are largely. Moving on from that, a consistent trend PEN America has noted across their 4 years of tracking book bans is that many of these book bans are not due to decisions made in reconsideration policies and processes. Quote, nor are they the direct result of legislation. As noted in PEN America's first Banning the USA report, just 4% of books banned in 2021 to 2022 followed the recommended processes for reconsideration challenges of books in school districts. For the 2024-2025 school year, vast numbers of books removed from shelves, pending investigation and permanently banned, came as a result of fear of legislation by school boards, administrators, and educators. End quote. So while there has previously always been a system to remove books from school libraries, if somebody looks at them and they deems that this might be inappropriate for children of a certain age demographic, they're not going through with this process most of the time. They're operating under fear from everyone around them, basically. Many school libraries and public libraries as well are being threatened with losing their funding, or even being or even being attacked into the potentially being closed down if they do not remove these books. So many librarians and educators feel like their hands are tied. So even if they do not agree with the statements being made, they do not have a choice, or else they're going to lose their livelihood, which is also insanely dangerous, to completely shut down a school or a library just because they have a few books that you personally do not agree with or might not want your child reading. Looking deeper into the numbers, PEN America has recorded 6,870 instances of book bans across 23 states and 87 public school districts. And they report that when taken all together, quote, since July 2021, our index records 22,810 cases of book bans across 45 states and 451 public school districts, which is an insane number of books that they're just pulling out of libraries for various reasons. Now, some of the data PEN America does admit has been more difficult to find access to or make more comprehensive because while in the past they have typically looked through book bans by titles, certain new two new indexes, the district level index and the state mandated banned index, have made this slightly more difficult. With the district level index presenting data on book bans by district, including the number of books banned, the sources of pressure, and then the pushback to all of these bans. However, this particular index does not include publicly available information for some specific banned titles, and also through the district level index, you cannot tell which specific school in the district initially started the banning of a certain title, or which parent, or whether or not a parent or an organization brought the information to the district initially, and then the book got widely banned from there. Now, this is the same with the state mandated bans index, instead of working at a district level, it works at more of the state level, where certain states, including Utah and South Carolina, have created state mandated no reads lists, with Tennessee also mandating such a list, where certain books are completely banned from every school district, every public school in the state, no exceptions. One effect of this that's not mentioned in the report, but that friends of mine have brought up that I believe is very important to include, is that the way this is going, this is potentially going to mean that, particularly if the Trump administration goes through with its plan of completely disbanding the Department of Education, that a child will get a completely different level and quality of education just entirely depending on which state they were born in and which state they live in, which is going to make things extremely complicated for students, especially those who are pursuing a higher education or looking for jobs that might be outside of their state. Because if a kid is born in, say, Kentucky, and they grew up in Kentucky and went to Kentucky public schools their entire lives, and then they want to apply to a college in Maryland, or maybe they're really looking to a job that's offered in Maryland, it's possible they could lose out on these opportunities just because the educational standards of Kentucky might greatly differ from those in Maryland, despite the two states being within the same nation, that this child simply may not qualify to go to college or pursue an education in Maryland, which is very concerning because that can also lead to a broader educational gap simply just between states. We already have massive educational gaps between kids based on income and also based on immigration status. So I feel like making such a broad gap between simply as much as which area of the country you were born in is going to make things extremely complicated for the future, and also just bring down the quality of life in the United States for all of us as a whole, because there would be so many students who are perfectly capable of doing great things with their lives, getting careers that could benefit everybody in the US who are just purposely being denied the resources to do this simply because of where they were born. Looking into specific titles, PEN America reports that book bans this past school year have affected 3,752 unique titles in 87 different school districts. Now, the most banned books of the year, including by PEN America's data, include A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, Sold by Patricia McCormick, A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas, Crank by Ellen Hopkins, The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. I apologize if I mispronounced their last name. And the screenplay for Wicked. Now, some of you may have noticed, as I did immediately, most of these books are either young adult or adult fiction, meaning that these books are almost entirely being banned from high schools as opposed to elementary and middle schools, because many of these books just wouldn't have been available in an elementary school. There is no elementary school in the country that is going to think that an 11-year-old could probably handle reading A Clockwork Orange. And I feel like a lot of the book ban stuff is kind of similar to a lot of hysteria around certain TV shows in particular when it comes to being targeted at kids and what is considered appropriate for kids versus what isn't. Where I think kids are being treated almost as some kind of monolith where they're not supposed to be. Like a 7-year-old and a 17-year-old are both minors under United States law, but the maturity difference between a 7-year-old and a 17-year-old is huge. Very, very different life experience. The 17-year-old has a lot more life experience and a lot more education than a 7-year-old, and also has a better understanding of how the world around them works and can better comprehend darker, more controversial topics than such a young child. Banning these books, particularly from high schools, is doing a massive disservice to teenagers who are swiftly approaching adulthood and need to have a better understanding of the more controversial and scary aspects of adult life that a lot of these books could very easily offer to them, or better explain to them, in a more safe environment, and also giving them the time and space to rationalize all of this in their head, or at least come to a better understanding of how the world around them works. Also, while admittedly there isn't any data on this, I do have a nagging feeling that book bans are at least partially responsible for how much reading seems to have fallen off as a hobby in recent years. If you're constantly banning a lot of books or taking away the access kids have to books that might actually interest them, as and have them only allowed to read like the same books that they've already read before, or books that are severely under their grade level that could be boring to them, they're going to grow up into thinking that reading is an extremely boring and lame activity and not a hobby that they would want to do. Meanwhile, if you give the kids access to all different forms of literature and other things that might actually on topics that might actually pique their interest, they're more likely to continue reading, continuing into adulthood, and also take time to think more, be exposed to more stories and more topics that they most likely would not be exposed to in TV, in movies, or on the internet. In the case of the internet, they're definitely going to be exposed to a lot of these topics in a much more responsible and nuanced manner than your average internet message board. And it also helps branch out kids' tastes to learn things. Like, I have typically always been a more soft and sensitive person, but I remember finding out that I actually love horror media because when I was a sophomore in high school, I just decided on a whim, kind of, to check out the book Cujo by Stephen King from my school's library, and I loved it so much that I started reading more of Stephen King's titles, which then later branched me out into reading more horror literature and then deciding to consume more horror TV shows and movies. I found a whole new genre of media that I had no idea I really liked, thanks to the availability of books in my high school library. And I would not be surprised, and I'd be very surprised if I was the only kid who ever had that experience. And while we were talking about Stephen King, he is actually the most banned author, according to PEN America's research, of this past school year, with 206 unique titles banned. He is closely followed by, actually not closely, he is followed by Ellen Hopkins with 167 titles banned, and Sarah J. Maas with 162 unique titles banned. I do find it interesting that this report includes specific authors whose titles are being banned because that's not something I have seen in previous years. Usually it's just one or two books that might have the same author that certain parents and organizations will have a problem with. Like when we're looking at overall book bans, historically, many authors will have more than one book pop up. Notable historical example in my mind, or I guess of a more classic form of literature, would be Toni Morrison having both The Bluest Eye and Beloved routinely banned or completely taken out of school libraries and public libraries. As a side note, I haven't read Beloved yet, although I do plan on it, but The Bluest Eye is such an amazing piece of literature. I highly recommend it if you've never read it. But anyway, I do find it interesting that they've gone to the point where they've gotten so familiar with certain authors' work, they're like, okay, let's just say for now, any book published by this author is banned, even if they release a new book that's completely different from what they've previously written. We're just going to ban it just in case. I am not too surprised by seeing Ellen Hopkins on there, considering Crank, as mentioned before, and a couple of her other books have routinely been banned by schools. Sarah J. Maas is slightly more surprising, although I do know that A Court of Mist and Fury is banned a lot, so I guess they've just decided to ban her entire series around that. Stephen King is actually the most shocking because even though Stephen King is known as a horror author and having books that have a lot of shocking elements to them, I've never actually noticed one of his individual books being widely banned. It's possible that in 2017, when the new It movie came out, that some parents were having issues with their teenage kids wanting to pick up more copies of the book because maybe they felt it was too much for their child to handle. But it is very difficult to know this information because book banning didn't really explode until the quarantine of 2020 due to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of the data of times before then is a bit more difficult to pick apart just because it wasn't being as closely monitored as it is today. So where do we go from here? It appears for the time that book banning is not slowing down, which is very disappointing to look into, especially since it's being compounded with the rise of other school subjects being attacked, like how in many places, at least in the United States, teaching kids the truth about the US Civil War and about chattel slavery and the certain language, a lot of the language being used in teaching that is starting to be policed, even though slavery was and still is a horrific atrocity, and everybody should believe that. And this will continue to do a disservice to students, particularly young students who are growing into adults, who are then going to enter the world not fully understanding the truth about the world they are entering, how widespread certain topics are, and how to handle certain situations when they come up. A prime example of this would be banning certain books for quote unquote sexual content. And I look specifically to Sold by Patricia McCormick for that one. Because Sold, for those who aren't familiar, is a book telling the story of a young girl who is sex trafficked. While it is easy for a lot of parents to look at this, and a lot of other orgs to look at this, and see that it is a very disturbing subject matter, they may not want their kids reading about it. It is important, particularly as your kids to get older, to understand how widespread this phenomenon is, because if you don't know that the issue exists, how exactly are you going to take steps to solve it? How are they going to how are we going to properly eradicate child sex trafficking if we want to act like child sex trafficking doesn't exist? Ignoring your problems is never going to actually make them go away. For another case of the sexual content stuff, what about cases of a child who is being sexually abused but is not aware of that because they're too young or have never been taught that what's happening to them is wrong and that they have a right to speak up about it, and whoever is harming them in this way is doing wrong and needs to stop and face consequences for it? A lot of people may think that they are protecting their kids by not exposing them to this kind of disturbing subject matter, but particularly as they grow into teenagers and then into adults, they need they need to have some, at least minimal, they need to have some mediated exposure to this subject matter. So so in the case that it ever comes up into their adult lives, they have a better understanding of what's happening around them and also how to better react to it. In conclusion, book banning, me personally, I do not like it. I find that it does a disservice to kids, it does a disservice to education, it does this, and doing a disservice to your educational system will always do a disservice to your society as a whole. You can't write off a certain kid, as just being a bad student if you've never actually taken the effort to teach them what they need to know. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to this episode. This is something that I've been really passionate about for a few years. It feels good to talk about it and maybe share it with a bunch of other people. Remember, if a book is ever on a banned list, I think that's more so just a sign that you should read it, even if it ends up being a book that's not particularly enjoyable. It is good to look at the subject matter in the book, unpack it, and still decide, well, what does this say about society, and is it something that we think should be restricted or not? To leave all of you off on some good news, for those who watched my previous episode, I did get the results of my GRE back. I got a 159 on the verbal reasoning section, a 154 on the quantitative reasoning section, and a 3.5 on the analytical writing section, which I am very happy about. And now, as far as graduate school goes, we just wait for the committee to review the results. And for another small piece of joy here, I have seen the video. As a longtime viewer of them, I did watch the video Dan and Phil posted at the beginning of the week. And not only am I just so happy for them that they finally feel comfortable enough to share such a personal part of their life with their audience, and I'm also very excited for the podcast. I feel like the video as a whole and a lot of the story surrounding the big news that they broke can offer a really good reminder that even though there are a ton of bad things in the world and so many things that try to burn us down and all of the struggles in the world, good things can and will persist. And I think we should never forget that. Again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you on the other side.